As thousands of desperate fugitive slaves trickled north, we know that some came through Waverly and several dozen ended up settling there. A separate segment on the website titled Settling on Waverly discusses that dramatic story. But first, it's important to step back and look at what sort of world the fugitives encountered up in the north. How did northern whites, the overwhelming majority population, regard black people? Well, it was complicated. The North was hardly of one mind on racial issues, and the runaways and their white abolitionist allies found themselves enmeshed in heated conflict and controversy. The truth is, most Northerners back then looked askance at black people. They didn't regard even freeborn blacks as actual fellow citizens, and many Northerners didn't see blacks as fully human and at all worthy of equal rights. For instance, in 1837, a meeting held in Carbondale to form an anti-slavery society was hijacked by white foes claiming to represent 9/10 of the town and who declared abolitionists to be, quote-unquote, enemies of the Union of the States. A quarter century later, during the Civil War, a young soldier from the Abington area wrote in his journal that he personally deplored slavery, but that the other white recruits in his Wilkes-Barre training camp were either, quote-unquote, Negro haters or were indifferent to Southern slavery. It's safe to say that was the common mentality of people, even in northeastern Pennsylvania. This segment gives a brief overview of the momentous conflicts over race through 5 lenses: legal, political, economic, religious, and what I call visceral. There is overlap between the categories, but they can be pulled apart in a useful way. Remember, this is all from the viewpoint of the ruling white Americans, who regarded this as, quote-unquote, the Negro question. Blacks had no real say in the matter, despite the efforts of intellectuals like Frederick Douglass, whose photo you see here. Let's start with the legal question. In the United States, slaves were simply property, a status that the courts repeatedly upheld. And a black slave counted as only 3/5 of a person for purposes of representative government. When the Constitution was being framed, the Southern delegates insisted on that status for black people as a way to increase Southern power. The North didn't want to lose the Southern states, so it agreed to that compromise as a way to set up the nation as a federal system. Slavery had even existed in much of the North for 2 centuries, but as it lost ground to wage labor, the states phased it out. Pennsylvania acted to gradually abolish slavery in 1780 and freed its last few remaining slaves in 1847. Still, the rights of free blacks in Pennsylvania and most of the rest of the North was always tenuous. They only got definite citizenship with the 14th Amendment right after the Civil War, and even that was hotly contested. And then there's the political consideration. The legal situation actually gave strength to the political. At heart, most whites, North and South, saw the country as, quote-unquote, a white republic. That was actually the open term for it. This mentality held that the nation was founded and settled by white Europeans, and black people were aliens, even though they had been here all along and done so much to build the nation. The white republic dogma intensified in the 1830s by the Jacksonian Democrats, who incidentally controlled most of northeastern Pennsylvania. With the emergence of the Whig Party, the Democrats saw blacks as an electoral threat. Consider the situation in Pennsylvania. The state constitution of the time did not prohibit black men from voting. It was colorblind on the issue. Officials set about changing the state constitution in 1837, and one of the officials who led the successful charge to explicitly deny blacks the vote was Andrew Bedford of Waverly. Another of them, Ebenezer Warren Sturtevant of Wilkes-Barre, said framers of the old 1790 Pennsylvania Constitution, quote, unquestionably regarded black people as a degraded race, and therefore took no notice of them. Esteeming them neither citizens nor free men, they left them where they had found them, in the enjoyment of no political rights, end quote. Sturtevant successfully argued that any effort to elevate blacks, quote, will degrade us. There was another important local figure in this voting conflict. His name was William Fogg, a gutsy mixed-race farmer in Abington Township, now Scott Township. Fogg brought a lawsuit in the mid-1830s when he wasn't allowed to vote. The case made it up to the state Supreme Court. The Chief Justice, John Bannister Gibson, the namesake of Gibson, PA, and whose illustration you see here, wrote the scathing decision that said, quote, no colored race was party to our social compact because our ancestors settled the province as a community of white men, end quote. Therefore, Gibson said, black men can't vote, or as he put it, quote, are destitute of title to the elective franchise, end quote. That ruling deprived all blacks of the vote for 33 years in Pennsylvania, and it set a precedent that reverberated around the country. The masterminds of this race-based policy never experienced a backlash. If anything, they kept advancing in public life and elected office. The Democrats, up to and well beyond the Civil War, knew that playing the white race card was a plus for them. For example, check out this Pennsylvania Democratic campaign poster from 1866. It proclaimed their candidate, quote, for the white man, and the Republican, quote, for the Negro. Pennsylvania's blacks looked to the Republicans for help, but they found that Republicans generally waffled in their support for black rights throughout the 19th century. Now let's consider economics and race. The slave economy was central to U.S. trade and growth, absolutely essential. For instance, more than half of the nation's exports between 1800 and 1860 consisted of raw cotton, almost all of it grown by slaves. This situation appalled many Northern abolitionists and led to the free produce movement, which advocated that people boycott the products of slave labor. But the North had no lack of apologists for the Southern slave system, and those people openly celebrated slavery's bounty. Listen to what Wilkes-Barre's George Washington Woodward said in a speech at Independence Hall in Philadelphia on the eve of the Civil War. Woodward, who's shown in this period portrait, had risen to become a justice of the state Supreme Court. Slavery benefits every citizen economically, Woodward told the crowd. Quote, the providence of that good being who has watched over us from the beginning and saved us from external foes has so ordered our internal relations as to make Negro slavery an incalculable blessing to us, Woodward declared. Quote, do you not see and feel how good it was for us to hand over our slaves to our friends of the South? How good it was for us that they have employed them in raising a staple for our manufacturers? How wise it was to so adjust the compromises of the Constitution that we could live in union with them and reap the signal advantages to which I have adverted. End quote. In a similar vein, the North Branch Democrat newspaper of Tunkhannock warned in 1862 during the Civil War that emancipating slaves would devastate people's pocketbooks. Quote, the loss of production to the world by freeing the Negro is enormous. In the item of groceries alone, the North is now paying $40 million more for them than she ought to do because their high price is occasioned by the idleness of the Negro. End quote. Such cold calculations of self-interest made it that much easier for Northerners to strip black people of their humanity. Not everyone was willing to go along with that cold calculation, and it was often because of religion. Northern abolitionists protested vociferously against slavery and became the fly in the ointment They were labeled as so-called disunionists, who were fanatically undermining the shaky national peace. But slavery's foes were able to deploy religion, scripture, as one of their most potent moral weapons in this momentous debate. Many abolitionists in northeastern Pennsylvania and elsewhere had been galvanized by the Second Great Awakening, a Christian renewal movement of that era, whose revivalists called on people to purify society of its sins, including human bondage. As abolitionists spread the word and tried to recruit allies to the anti-slavery cause, they could cite faith-based tenets, such as the biblical call to hospitality and the Golden Rule. The clincher for many was the stirring command in Deuteronomy, quote, "Thou shalt not deliver unto his master the servant which hath escaped unto thee. He shall dwell with thee, even among you, in that place which he shall choose, in one of thy gates where it liketh him best. Thou shalt not oppress him." End quote. Armed with those arguments, the abolitionists were pressing their churches to take a stand, which in the process forced a number of schisms. There's more about that in the Waverly segment. Religious conservatives had their rebuttals. They could always cite the so-called curse of Ham. This was a belief that black people were doomed to subjugation and slavery because of an ancient curse that Noah had placed on the line of his son Ham for a biblical transgression. Africans were believed to descend from that line and thus inherited the divine curse. That was not the only argument churches used against anti-slavery forces. Consider the Presbyterian stance. In 1837, Presbyterian officials in the large church region that encompassed Greater Abington called on their congregations to, quote, "avoid all unnecessary excitement on the subject of slavery and abolitionism," end quote. The work of the abolitionists, they said, is, quote, "unnecessary, unscriptural, and pernicious," end quote. Unnecessary, they argued, because slavery had been abolished in Pennsylvania. Unscriptural, because Jesus never crusaded against the Roman slavery of his day. And pernicious because, quote, "it tends directly to the division of the church and ultimately to the destruction of the federal union," end quote. However, the record of activism in the region's Presbyterian, Methodist, and Baptist churches shows the conflict would not go away, despite what the leadership counseled. Finally, let's consider the visceral attitudes. The abolitionists could make all the appeals they wanted to welcoming the stranger, but many whites of the era weren't going to be swayed by moral arguments. The truth is, they had a gut aversion to black people. It was a learned aversion that stemmed from the pseudo-scientific thinking that the races could be ranked and that blacks were at the bottom. Look at this book ad that ran in the Luzerne Union of Wilkes-Barre in 1861. The book said that blacks were, quote, "a different and inferior species of man," end quote, and that, quote, "nature has not given him the specific faculties, capabilities, wants, etc. of the white man, and hence that the social laws which apply to the one race cannot apply to the other," end quote. According to this mentality, then, blacks were subhuman and subject to brute emotions, making them somehow both dull-witted and sneaky, both cowardly and dangerous. Thus, the goal was to keep the races apart, to avoid, quote-unquote, amalgamation at all costs. Even white abolitionists could be victim to this thinking. That's why some embraced the colonization movement, which aimed to buy slaves freedom, but then ship them far away to Africa. Some radical humanitarians did see blacks as equal, but others who got involved took a more condescending view. As the leader of the Anti-Slavery and Free Discussion Society said in an 1836 speech in Montrose, abolitionism's mission was, quote, "to restore the oppressed children of Africa to that niche in the architecture of society which the great founder designed," or in other words, which they are qualified to fill, end quote. Black men certainly demonstrated their equal worth as soldiers during the Civil War. Even many white officers attested to that. But a few years later, a military report, again based on pseudoscientific studies, found blacks to be, quote, very low in the seals of human evolution, end quote, and found black soldiers to be, quote, too animal to have moral courage or endurance. This is not a pretty picture, and it isn't what we highlight in our standard history, but it's what the fugitives and free blacks found were challenging realities in the North well up into the 20th century. This was despite the best efforts of black leaders and their white allies to undo racist attitudes. It makes Waverly, where blacks mingled fairly easily, stand out all the more.